How do you write stories that shaped queer fandom and then turn around and fight the fans who saw themselves in them? Today, we're talking about Interview with the Vampire and the contradiction at the heart of Anne Rice's legacy. Anne Rice invented slash fiction before fandom had a name for it. Her novels thrummed with male-male desire, with power dynamics and seduction, and the erotics of surrender. She understood queer longing so deeply that she became a foundational text for an entire generation of fans who recognized themselves in those vampiric entanglements. And then she sued her fans for doing exactly what she had done. This contradiction defines her legacy. For years, she threatened cease and desist letters against fanfiction writers, tracked them down, doxed them, harassed them online. Real people received real legal paperwork from her publishers. Into the 2000s, the disclaimers that became standard in fanfiction, "I do not own these characters," existed partly because of the legal terror Rice inspired. Yet her later interviews suggest her reasons were practical rather than moral. Her fear was liability, that fan ideas might circle back and she'd be sued for stealing from them. It was about control, the same concern that made many authors of her era hostile to fan works. By 2012, she'd softened. It's been very easy to avoid reading any. Live and let live. But the damage was done. Neil Jordan's adaptation exposes something deeper. Rice knew vampirism was a queer story, and she was terrified that knowledge would stop the film from being made. When Rice wrote the screenplay, she seriously considered rewriting Louis as a woman. She even imagined Cher in the role, believing a heterosexual love story would be more palatable to 1994 audiences. She had internalized Hollywood's homophobia, even while writing one of cinema's most homoerotic texts. Her public campaign against Tom Cruise's casting reveals this same anxiety. She called it bizarre and impossible, championing other actors instead. But Cruise won out. Then something remarkable happened. After seeing the finished film, Rice called Cruise to apologize, eventually praising his performance extravagantly. She had been wrong. What changed? Perhaps she realized that Jordan had found a way to make the queerness work precisely by keeping it implicit, by trusting audiences to fill in what couldn't be explicit. And they did. Queer audiences watched Tom Cruise's Lestat seduce Brad Pitt's Louis through blood-sucking, deeply homoerotic, undeniably intimate, and found themselves reflected in those implicit spaces. For a generation starved of meaningful representation, the subtext became text through sheer force of interpretation. They provided the connective tissue that made the mythology come alive. Jordan's genius lies in visualizing what Rice wanted to articulate. Vampirism is not sexy. It's an endless sadness. Lestat seduces Louis with promises of power while concealing the truth. Insatiable hunger satisfied only through killing, infinite loneliness. The casual predation on vulnerable people emerges not as fantasy, but as horror. Each seduction dissolves from romance into terror and death. The cycles of abuse are shown rather than explained. Lestat creates Claudia from fear of abandonment, keeping her perpetually dependent, a doll frozen in childhood, forever promised the adult life she'll never have. Louis, bound by guilt, can never leave. The film makes visible the predatory structures Rice knew were there. When the AMC series premiered in 2022, it did something Rice would never allow her fans to do in the past. It reinterpreted her source material entirely. Jacob Anderson and Sam Reed's Louis and Lestat aren't coded queer characters. They're explicitly queer and deeply flawed people. The shift of Louis from a white plantation owner to a mixed-race Creole man in 1910's Storyville fundamentally recontextualizes what his suffering means, what his attraction to Lestat represents, what his refusal to kill signifies in a world built on systematic exploitation. Bailey Bass and Delaney Hales also do a magnificent job of portraying Claudia's growing awareness of her own confinement, the bitterness that follows, and the rage at being trapped in a body that the world will never take seriously. Even the casting of Asad Zaman and Eric Bogosian was a bold and brilliant move. They don't just deepen Armand and Daniel, they expand what the story can become, opening dimensions Rice's novels never explored. The show used adaptation as an act of interpretation. It asked different questions about Rice's work, filled in gaps not with nostalgia, but with contemporary understanding of her blind spots. Here's a show backed by her own estate, doing what fandom always understood, that her work only truly comes alive when someone else claims it, reshapes it, provides the emotional logic the source material couldn't quite manage on its own. The third season, premiering June 7th, 2026, 6 takes this conversation deepest. After 2 seasons centered on Louis's perspective, the show shifts entirely to Lestat's. He refuses to be the villain in someone else's story. He forms a rock band. He goes on tour. He literally stages his own narrative in response to Louis's published memoir, demanding the right to narrate his own existence rather than remaining trapped in another person's interpretation. We're curious how the interview with the vampire, which has handled the story with such care so far, will approach Lestat's turn at the center, especially when his history carries threads of coercion, exploitation, and deeply uncomfortable power imbalances. His turning, his relationships, and even parts of his human life echo with violation, shaped by emotional manipulation and inherited trauma. And that story doesn't exist in isolation. It collides with the trauma carried by Louis, Armand, and Claudia, whose lives have been shaped in the wake of his choices. As the narrative shifts into his hands, it raises a harder question. What happens when someone like Lestat gets to define his own story? To truly read Anne Rice means understanding there's always a second narrative dancing behind the lines, one she didn't fully write, but that lives in the spaces she left open. It means loving her work while refusing it as gospel, celebrating her imagination while questioning her conclusions. The 1994 film built connective tissue through cinema. The AMC series built it through contemporary reinterpretation. Fandom built it through endless readings and what if, and refusal to accept her text as final. The text only becomes fully itself when it's allowed to evolve. This is Ladies First, watching women in movies. Here, we empower women by reviewing and discussing films that highlight their stories, struggles, and achievements. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.